The plane's wheels touched down with a low thud, and the cabin erupted in the usual shuffle, seatbelts clicking, overhead bins creaking open, voices buzzing with reunion plans. I sat still, my hands folded over the small bag in my lap. 10 hours in the air, 2 weeks away, and a funeral in between had hollowed me out in ways I hadn't yet begun to process. As the line of passengers inched toward the open door, I pulled out my phone. My fingers hovered over the family group chat for a moment. Then I typed, "Guys, flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" The message sent, 2 gray ticks appearing instantly. I slipped the phone into my pocket and stepped into the narrow jet bridge. A gust of airport air met me, drier, sharper than I'd remembered, and I kept moving, the rhythm of my footsteps out of sync with the chatter of those around me. Inside the terminal, I followed the familiar maze toward baggage claim. Families pressed against the barrier rail, waving, calling out names. I watched one man drop his suitcase mid-step to scoop up a little girl who had barreled into his arms. Her laughter echoed across the hall. My phone stayed silent. The carousel whirred to life, spitting out cases in every size and color. I found mine, scuffed, dented, heavy, and dragged it to the side. With one hand gripping the handle, I unlocked my phone. Still no reply. I opened the chat again, staring at my own message sitting there like a paper boat in an empty pond. 3 dots appeared. My heart kicked once, then the words blinked into existence. "We're busy. Try Uber." I read it twice. The first time, it stung. The second time, it lodged somewhere deep, in the space between my ribs where love for my children had always lived. There was no follow-up, no question about the flight, no acknowledgement of where I had been or why. I had flown thousands of miles home after laying my husband to rest in the country where he was born, and the only family I had left had responded like I was a stranger asking for a favor. I swallowed, the metallic taste of exhaustion coating my mouth. Around me, people laughed, embraced, took pictures. A boy about 10 tugged at his mother's coat, pointing toward the exit, where a man held up a handmade "Welcome Home" sign. She knelt, zipped his jacket, and took his hand. I stood still, suitcase handle biting into my palm, phone screen still glowing. If you're new here, I share these true stories every day. Make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. It means more than you know. The terminal doors whooshed open and closed as travelers came and went. Somewhere in the swirl of motion, I realized my face had gone numb. Not from the cold, but from holding back words I knew I'd never get to say without breaking. It felt like someone had reached through the screen and slammed the door in my face. I was still staring at my daughter's message when the screen lit up again. Another reply. This time from my son. "Why didn't you plan better?" For a moment, I thought I'd misread it. My thumb hovered over the glass, but the words stayed there, black against white, sharp enough to cut. I let out a slow breath, feeling it catch in my chest. So that was it. Not just one child too busy to help, but both ready to point a finger, as if my need for them was an inconvenience I'd brought upon myself. It wasn't as though I'd forgotten how to organize my life. I'd booked the earliest flight I could after the service, moving mountains to get back in time for a meeting at the bank about our affairs. I'd been juggling arrangements, embassy paperwork, hotel bills, all without a single offer of help from either of them. Now, standing in the middle of an airport full of happy reunions, I was being scolded like a child who'd missed a school bus. My grip tightened on the suitcase handle until my knuckles ached. Grief has a way of shrinking you, of making you feel smaller and smaller until you're easy to ignore. Since his passing, I'd learned just how invisible I could be. It was as though his absence had erased the part of me that mattered to them. In my mind, I could still see the church where I'd stood just days earlier. A framed photo of my husband beside the casket. His smile in that picture, warm, certain, was how I wanted to remember him. But when I'd turned to look at the rows of chairs, 2 of them had been empty. My children's chairs. The excuse had been work commitments and short notice, but I knew better. They hadn't wanted the inconvenience. And now, here I was, fresh from lowering him into the ground, holding a phone that offered nothing but curt replies and a confirmation that I was, in their eyes, an afterthought. People moved around me in every direction, suitcases rolling, heels clicking, greetings called out in bursts of joy. Somewhere to my left, a woman in her 60s was surrounded by what looked like 3 generations of family, all talking over each other, hugging, smiling through tears. I had to look away. The second message sat there in the chat, paired with the first. 2 blunt sentences from 2 grown adults I'd once rocked to sleep, defended in school meetings, stayed up late for when they were sick. I wondered if they even remembered. The boarding announcements echoed overhead, and I realized my hands were trembling. Not from the weight of my luggage, but from the weight of knowing that the 2 people who should have been my safest place had just confirmed there was no place for me at all. And yet, I typed my next message, without letting any of that show. I wheeled my suitcase toward an empty stretch of seating near baggage claim, and lowered myself into the hard plastic chair. The air felt dry, recycled through too many lungs, but it was the quiet in my chest that bothered me more. Across from me, a young couple spotted someone they knew and erupted into laughter, rushing into a tangle of hugs. Behind them, an older man bent to kiss the crown of a toddler's head before scooping her up, his eyes closing, as though he wanted to keep that moment forever. I sat with my hands folded over the suitcase handle, my knuckles pale against the worn black fabric. The ache in my legs reminded me of the hours I'd spent seated on the flight, but I couldn't summon the energy to shift or stretch. My chest felt heavier by the minute, each breath carrying the residue of words I wouldn't allow myself to speak. "Welcome to arrivals." The announcement floated above us in a cheerful tone, followed by a list of flight numbers and destinations. It played again a few minutes later, different words but the same cadence, as if the airport itself was reminding me I'd come home to no one. I remembered a time when baggage claim had meant something else. My husband would always find the spot nearest the sliding doors, hands buried in his jacket pockets, eyes scanning every face until they landed on mine. Then the smile, wide, warm, and just for me. Even after decades of marriage, he'd still reach for the suitcase without a word, as though carrying my load was as natural as breathing. Once, when the children were still small, they'd both been at his side, bouncing on their toes, holding up a crayon-scribbled "Welcome, Mum" sign. That piece of paper had ended up pinned to the fridge for years, the colors fading, but the memory staying bright. Now, there were no signs, no one pushing through the crowd to reach me first, just the carousel turning slowly, each rotation sounding louder than it should. Another group passed by, their chatter spilling over me without stopping. I caught the scent of fresh flowers from the bouquet one woman carried, the petals brushing against her scarf as she leaned into an embrace. I tightened my grip on the suitcase handle, the urge to send another message pulsed through me, something to soften the sting, to bridge the gap they'd created with those cold replies. But the thought passed quickly. No, I wouldn't ask again. If they could live with leaving me to find my own way after everything, then I could live with letting them. The carousel clicked once more, and the doors to the outside world slid open, letting in a rush of night air. I rose from the chair, the decision solid in my chest. I wasn't going to beg for their help. Not now, not ever again. I slid my phone out of my coat pocket and tapped into the group chat. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard for a few seconds before I typed the 2 words I knew would cost me nothing on the surface, yet everything underneath. No worries. 2 words that didn't match the tightness in my chest or the way my stomach felt like it was folding in on itself. I'd done it before. Hidden hurt behind something tidy and easy for them to swallow. The first time was years ago, when they forgot my birthday until the evening, and I laughed it off, saying I'd been too busy to celebrate anyway. Another time, it was Christmas morning, when they called hours late, already at someone else's gathering. I'd told them to enjoy themselves, masking the lump in my throat with a cheerful tone. Back then, I told myself it was for peace, that some things were better left unspoken. But peace, I've learned, can be just another word for silence. The airport cafe was just steps away, the smell of burnt espresso drifting into the seating area. I walked over and ordered the smallest coffee they had, not because I wanted it, but because I needed something to hold, something to keep my hands from shaking. The cup was warm, but it didn't reach the rest of me. I sat at a small table by the window, my suitcase tucked against my leg, and glanced at my phone again. Both of them were online. Both had seen my "no worries." Neither had replied. The little green dots beside their names were like tiny lanterns glowing in the dark. Proof they were there. Proof they were choosing not to answer. Outside, the airport traffic was shifting with the hour. The sky had faded into a deep, bruised blue. Headlights snaked in long lines toward the drop-off lanes. The taxi line had doubled, people shuffling forward with tired faces, glancing at their watches. I could have joined them. I could have tapped my phone screen, called an Uber, and been home in an hour. But the thought made something in me resist. Not out of pride exactly, but out of the quiet knowledge that I didn't owe them this scene. The one where I appear small, defeated, needing to be rescued after all. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitterness sit on my tongue. The decision came without fanfare. I wouldn't take a taxi. I wouldn't open that ride-hailing app. There was another way home. One that didn't involve them. I reached into my handbag for my address book, the paper kind I still carried, flipping past names I hadn't called in years, until I landed on the one I wanted. My finger lingered on it. If they had no place for me tonight, I would find somewhere that did. My finger rested on a name I hadn't said out loud in nearly 3 years. Anne. We'd once worked side by side for a decade, shared coffee breaks, and swapped recipes over lunch. When my husband fell ill, she'd sent casseroles and handwritten notes. But life, as it often does, had shifted us apart. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the call button. It felt almost intrusive, dragging someone into this moment. But then I thought about the unread group chat, the silence from the 2 people I had raised, and I pressed call. It rang twice before I heard her voice. "Hello? Anne, it's me." A pause, then a burst of warmth. "My goodness, are you back? Where are you?" "At the airport," I said, my voice thinner than I intended. "Just landed. I don't have a ride." There was no hesitation. "Stay right where you are. I'll be there in half an hour. Don't argue." Her certainty caught me off guard. I'd grown used to making myself small, to not asking for much. The call ended quickly, her promise hanging in the air like a lifeline. When she arrived, she didn't bother with small talk. She wrapped me in a hug that smelled faintly of lavender, the kind of hug that reminds you you're still here, still seen. She grabbed my suitcase handle with one hand, steering us toward her car. The engine purred to life and we pulled away from the chaos of the terminal. For a while, neither of us spoke. The hum of the tires on the road filled the space. Finally, she glanced over. "I'm so sorry about him. I wish I could have been there." I nodded, swallowing the ache in my throat. "It was quiet, too quiet." She sighed, the sound carrying its own kind of grief. "People don't mean to disappear, they just move on faster when it's not their loss." Her words sat between us, heavy but true. I found myself speaking without thinking. "They didn't come to the funeral, my own children." Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. "That's..." She shook her head, eyes fixed on the road. "There's no excuse for that. Once I might have defended them, said they were busy, that travel was expensive, that it was just bad timing. But tonight the words wouldn't come. I didn't feel the need to shield them anymore. Instead, I watched the streetlights flicker across the windshield and felt something inside me shift. It wasn't anger exactly, but it wasn't the old ache either. It was steadier, clearer. I'd spent years cushioning their mistakes, finding reasons to forgive before they'd even asked. But forgiveness given too freely can turn into permission. As we drove through familiar streets, I realized I was done granting it without consequence. Anne pulled into my driveway, the headlights sweeping across the empty windows. She reached over, gave my hand a squeeze. "Call me anytime. I mean it." "I will," I said. And for once I meant that too. Anne's taillights disappeared at the end of the street, leaving me on the front step with my suitcase and a ring of keys that suddenly felt heavier than they should. The house loomed in the quiet, its windows dark except for the faint glow of the porch light I'd left on before my trip. Inside, the air felt still, as though it had been holding its breath in my absence. My suitcase wheels bumped along the hall runner until I stopped just inside the living room. His photos were exactly where I'd left them, one on the mantel from our trip to Florence, another by the lamp showing him in the garden, sleeves rolled up, face tilted toward the sun. I ran a hand over the arm of his favorite chair, still draped with the knitted throw he'd use on cool evenings. The faint scent of his cologne lingered in the fabric, almost enough to trick me into thinking he might walk through the doorway any moment. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The quiet tick of the gas igniter, the slow rumble as the flame caught, it all seemed louder without conversation to soften it. I took down my mug, the one with the tiny chip on the handle, and set a tea bag inside. As the water heated, I imagined what I might have said if they'd picked me up. Maybe I'd have told them about the service, the way the priest spoke of loyalty and love, the kindness of strangers who came to stand with me. I would have thanked them for coming, even though they hadn't. I would have tried to keep the peace, to smooth over what couldn't be mended in one car ride. The kettle whistled softly, and I poured the water, watching the steam rise in delicate curls. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat soak into my fingers. A memory surfaced unbidden. Years ago, standing at this very stove, while my husband bundled the children into coats, announcing they were off to get me from the airport. They'd come barreling through the arrival doors, all talking at once, shoving handmade cards into my hands. I'd thought then that I was the luckiest woman in the world. Now I stood in the same kitchen, tea cooling in my hands, and realized luck had nothing to do with it. What we had back then was intention, an effort to show up for each other. Somewhere along the way, they'd stopped making that effort. And I had allowed it. That thought settled over me like a weight and a release at the same time. I wasn't just grieving my husband. I was grieving the part of myself that had let too much slide. I sipped my tea and felt something unusual stir in my chest. Not rage, not sorrow, but a clarity that I couldn't ignore. Maybe this was the moment to stop waiting for them to change. Maybe it was the moment to act. I was halfway through my second cup of tea when the phone rang. The sound cut through the quiet so suddenly that I nearly spilled what was left in the mug. The number on the screen wasn't one I recognized, but I answered anyway. Hello? A warm, professional voice came through the line. We're reaching out on behalf of the Community Foundation. We're hosting an event tonight to honor local contributors, and we'd be so pleased if you could join us. Your name came highly recommended after, well, everything you've done over the years. For a moment, I didn't speak. The words felt far away, as though they were meant for someone else. Tonight? I finally asked. Yes, at the town hall. It's a small gathering, nothing too formal, but we'd love for you to say a few words. People need to hear your story. My first instinct was to decline. I was tired. My suitcase still sat in the hallway. My mind was heavy with the weight of the day. But then, a sharper thought broke through. My children didn't think I was worth picking up from the airport. They had no interest in hearing my voice, my experiences, or my needs. If my family couldn't see me, maybe the world would. I'll come, I said, my voice steadying as I spoke. What time should I be there? Doors open at 7, but we'd like you there a little earlier. When the call ended, I stayed seated for a moment, letting the words settle over me. They wanted me there. They wanted to hear from me. Not because I'd begged for attention, but because I had earned it. I rose from the table and made my way to the bedroom. My wardrobe was still a mix of everyday comfort and the clothes I used to wear when my husband and I would attend dinners or charity functions. I pushed past the sweaters and cardigans until my hand landed on a deep emerald dress. It had been his favorite on me, the color bringing out what he used to call the fire in your eyes. I laid it across the bed, then found my black heels, still polished from the last time I wore them. At the dressing table, I brushed my hair until it shone, applying a touch of makeup. Not to hide myself, but to step forward as the version of me I wanted the world to see. The woman in the mirror didn't look like someone who had been left standing alone in an airport. She looked like someone with somewhere to be, and people who would be glad to see her arrive. By the time I slipped the coat over my shoulders, the heaviness in my chest had shifted. I wasn't going just to fill a seat. I was going to take up space. The town hall's front steps glowed under a row of soft golden lights, the kind that made everything feel a little more important. As I approached, the sound of laughter and gentle conversation drifted into the night air. Inside, the room was warm, buzzing with quiet energy. Round tables draped in white linen, polished silverware catching the light from crystal chandeliers. A woman in a tailored navy suit greeted me at the entrance. "We're so glad you could make it," she said, her hand warm around mine. "Your seat is right near the front." It caught me off guard, the certainty in her tone, the way she looked at me like I belonged here. Hours earlier, my own children couldn't be bothered to pick me up from the airport. Now strangers were leading me to a place of honor. I was seated among business owners, community leaders, and volunteers who had poured themselves into causes they believed in. As courses were served, people leaned in to ask me about my work, my husband's legacy, the years we'd spent building something from nothing. Every question was framed with respect. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium, the weight of the microphone in my hand steadier than I'd expected. A hush fell over the room. I began with gratitude, thanking the community for its support during my husband's illness, for showing up when I'd needed it most. Then I spoke about resilience. Not the kind you read in headlines, but the quiet kind that keeps you putting one foot in front of the other when no one is clapping. I told them how my husband had taught me that strength wasn't loud, and that building something worthwhile meant weathering more storms than you ever thought you could survive. I could see heads nodding, eyes focused on mine. It was the first time in a long while that I felt the weight of my own voice, and knew it was being heard. The applause at the end was warm. Not the polite sort you give out of obligation. It rolled through the room like a wave, reaching me where I stood. For a moment, I simply let it wash over me. Afterwards, a young woman from the local news approached with a cameraman in tow. "Could we get a few words for tonight's broadcast?" she asked. I agreed, and under the bright camera lights, I spoke again. Not for the people watching at home, not even for my children, but for myself. I wanted a record of this moment, proof that I was more than the sum of my disappointments. Cameras flashed as I stepped away, catching the curve of my smile, the straightness of my posture. It wasn't about pride, it was about presence. I had been invisible for too long, and now the world could see me again. As I moved back to my seat, I noticed the quiet inside me wasn't the emptiness I'd carried earlier that day. It was space that belonged to me. The event ended with handshakes, photographs, and more invitations than I'd expected. By the time I stepped out into the cool night air, my cheeks ached from smiling. But it wasn't the forced kind. It was the kind that came from being seen. I slid into the back of the taxi that had been arranged for me, settling against the seat as the city lights streamed past the window. That's when my phone began to vibrate. Once, twice, then in a rapid, insistent rhythm that filled the small space. I pulled it from my bag. The family group chat, silent all day, was now alive with messages. From my daughter, "Mom, we just saw you on TV, what's going on?" From my son, "Why didn't you tell us you were going to be at that event? You looked different. Everyone's talking about it." Another from my daughter, this one faster, almost panicked. "Can we talk? Call me." A link followed. I tapped it, and there I was. My image on the evening news, standing at the podium, the headline beneath me reading, "Local businesswoman honored for lifetime contribution." The clip showed me speaking, eyes steady, voice sure, thanking the community for its support through difficult times. I stared at the screen for a moment, not at the headline, not at the praise in the segment, but at the woman it showed. She looked composed, present, whole. The messages kept coming. "We didn't know you were doing things like that." "Mom, why didn't you tell us? Can we come over tomorrow?" The irony was almost too neat to believe. Hours ago, I'd been standing in an airport wondering if I even registered on their radar. Now their phones had lit up because strangers had celebrated me. I didn't feel smug. I didn't feel the urge to gloat. What I felt was a quiet settling inside me, like a puzzle piece finally finding its place. Out of the corner of my eye, the streetlights blurred into long lines, and for just a moment, I imagined my husband sitting beside me. That familiar half-smile of his, the one he'd wear when I'd done something he admired but wouldn't say out loud straight away. I could almost hear him. "You didn't need them to clap for you, but it's nice when they finally do." I locked the phone and slipped it back into my bag. The driver asked if I wanted the radio on. I shook my head, preferring the hum of the engine and the quiet in my own mind. They could wait. Tonight, I wasn't hurrying to answer anyone. The house was still when I walked in, The only sound, the faint tick of the clock in the hallway. I hung my coat on its hook, the fabric still holding the faint scent of perfume from the evening. My heels clicked softly against the floor as I made my way to the kitchen. I filled the kettle, setting it on the stove. While it heated, I opened my bag and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up with their messages, one after another, stacked high enough that I had to scroll. I didn't read them in a rush. I took my time, letting my eyes linger on each one. The surprise, the urgency, the sudden warmth they hadn't found for me hours earlier. It was a strange sort of symmetry. Earlier, I'd been the one waiting for their reply, the silence stretching like a closed door. Now, they were the ones waiting, watching for those little dots that would tell them I was answering. The kettle whistled. I poured the water over the tea bag, watching the deep amber spread through the cup. My hands didn't tremble this time. I set the cup on the table, unlocked the phone again, and began typing. Only one sentence. I'm busy. Try each other. I hit send, then placed the phone face down on the table. The tea was hot, its steam curling upward, warming my cheeks. I sat there for a long while, letting the quiet fill the space between me and all the noise of the day. For years, I'd measured my worth by how much I was needed, how quickly I could show up, how often I could make their lives easier. But tonight had made something clear. My worth didn't need their permission. I thought of my husband again, his steady way of looking at me when he believed I'd done something right. I could almost feel it now, that invisible nod. Some arrivals don't need a welcoming party. Sometimes, arriving for yourself is enough. I took a sip of tea, the warmth spreading through me in a way that felt like the first true comfort I'd had all day. The phone stayed silent. Maybe they didn't know what to say. Maybe they were still trying to figure out when the balance had shifted. But I knew. I'd stopped standing in arrival halls hoping for the wrong people to turn up. I'd found my own way home. If this story touched you, tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe every parent deserves respect, like and subscribe for more true stories.